Thank you, Shannon, and it's a great privilege to be here chairing what I'm sure will be a really fantastic discussion. To remind you of that, artists influencing change. We'll consider how contemporary art might be seen as a form of radical pedagogy to highlight marginal voices and influence social change. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to welcome all First Nations peoples joining us here tonight. A brief introduction of the artists, of the panel members and their respective practices. Courtney Coombs makes art, writes, facilitates and collaborates to try and make sense of the world and their place in it. Their practice responds to the cis heteronormative patriarchal structures of both art world and society more broadly, using strategies such as subjective voice, personal narrative, humour and metaphor. Hookey. Gordon's works in a distinctive figurative painting style, such as that on the screen right now, that is urgently political, calling both politicians and constituents to account for the past and continuing oppression of Aboriginal people. Hooky pulls no punches with a style that is often darkly humorous, layered with visual puns and linguistic mischievousness. And then to my right, Sarwari is a multidisciplinary visual artist born in Afghanistan who has lived in Australia for the past 19 years. In his work, Sarwari gives form to the notion of statelessness, with a pointed reference to the political discourse around migration, place, identity and nationhood. I'd just also like to acknowledge Griffith University Art Museum for hosting this important discussion, and especially to Shannon Brett for organising tonight's panel. I also want to acknowledge this fabulous exhibition in which tonight's panel is being convened, Common Knowledge and Learning Curves by Keg D'Souza, which really embodies the way in which art can provide new models of learning, organising and participation. So my role is to facilitate this conversation and ask a series of questions of the panel members. There will also be opportunity at the end of the discussion for the audience to ask questions. Before we begin, I just wanted to provide a brief preamble as a way of contextualising the discussion ahead and maybe provide a provocation for the panel members to think about in relation to their own practices. So tonight's conversation happens at a very timely moment, both within a local context as well as reflecting broader global currents. The May edition of Art Forum is actually focused on art and activism, very conveniently for us. And David Velasco notes in his editorial, "We want art to do more. To be modern, art must follow a simple edict: don't instrumentalise. To seek utility is to sacrifice art's special force. Art is at once valuable and invaluable, secular and sacred. It is porous nearly to the point of its own extinction, but its permeability is also the source of its tenacity. These contradictions form art's uneasy, fertile subduction zone." So the efficacy of art in facilitating social and political change is a defining concern of contemporary practice. And the three artists on our panel tonight represent really powerful voices addressing a range of important issues through their work, including gender, history, identity, race and politics, confronting and discomforting viewers and subverting mainstream viewpoints. So to begin, I just thought we might unpack the topic for tonight a little bit. And I want to start with Courtney, because we talked about this the other day when we were discussing tonight. Courtney, do you see yourself as a change agent?
No.
Do you want to maybe talk about why do you feel that way?
I feel like that term makes it bigger or something than what it is I think I'm ever possible of doing with art. I think I feel nervous about that, about the implications or the expectations that come with such a big title, I suppose. But I do hope that art can create change, and I do think that artists can help us to see the world differently, which can then create change. And I hope that for my work, maybe that is trying to do that anyway, I guess, just to expand an understanding of the world.
Gordon, what about you? Do you think that art can affect change?
Well, I don't consciously think that way about the work that I do. I don't really care, basically, whether I do or not, because I'm just too busy making it. You know, if whatever I do influences people one way or the other, I say good. You know, because the work that I do, I'm just responding to certain things, you know, within my world anyway. And I don't even know, once it leaves the studio, whether people see it or not. And, you know, it doesn't matter either whether they do or not, as far as I'm concerned, you know, because I do it and I basically move on from that. I'm too busy, you know, doing other things to worry about whether, you know, I'm altering this perception or being, you know, an agent for change or whatever. But if so, you know, I could live with that, and, you know, I'm happy if people, you know, look at my work, you know, because, you know, when you think about it, so many artists that do work, you know, don't get their work seen or hung or shown or whatever. So, you know, basically in the arts, it's more of a crime to be ignored.
Well, you're not being ignored.
Maybe I should call Crime Stoppers.
Shah, what about you? I mean, and I just want to say this is the first time I've actually met Shah tonight, so I'm as much new to your practice as maybe some of the other people here. What are your thoughts around this idea of art and social change, or its efficacy in creating change?
Well, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of this land that we are standing gathering here tonight. I would like to acknowledge the elders, both past and present, and the youths, that is the future. And what is wonderful way to, I mean, this tradition of acknowledging the past and what happened, and this is when I hear this in Australia, and when I myself do it, I think of my own history, that what has happened in Afghanistan has been forgotten to my own people, the Hazaras. To your question, to be honest, when I came to art school, I came here to learn how to make beautiful things, to infuse some hope in my life. But in a way, I think the institution like the university kind of guided me to delve into these topics of like refugee or what I have gone through. At the beginning, I was naive. Yeah, I was thinking that I can make change, but I've came across so many walls just in my personal life, that I no longer think that way, that my art can change people, because I think for the past 15, 16 years or 17 years that I've lived in Australia, this issue of refugee has been at the forefront of politics, and it's got to the point where we just witnessed a very horrible massacre in New Zealand. So, and it's just this election that it's just got quiet, and suddenly no one talks about it, and it has made me even more worried that a sudden quietness is also not good. We need to talk about these issues, but yeah. So again, on the topic of change, I think my presence in this spaces like this and other public spaces I've experienced that I've come across people that do not like me to be here, and they have questioned. So I think me having conversation with them and trying to, tell my story, I think do change a little bit what they think of refugees or asylum seekers, or the issues that my work encompasses.
Shah, you just talked about coming to study here, and we're in an institutional environment. Courtney, you also teach. You teach at QUT, as well as make art, and are involved in causes and things that you believe in. How do you make sense of that as a whole, as a person? I mean, can you articulate a relationship between those different facets, or is it one thing?
Do you mean the different facets, like teaching and making? And
correct.
For me, it's one thing. For me, it took me a long time to figure out that running REs, writing articles, teaching at university, making art was all my practice. And I think that once I realised that, it took the pressure off, art having to change the world, or it meant that these are all of the things that I'm trying to do to understand the world better. And so I see them as all connected.
From idealism to despair. Can you maybe just talk about that while it's on the screen?
So that work was made for site works down at Bundanon, and I was thinking about responding to the space, and more as I was travelling to the site, I just kept seeing all of the destruction of the landscape. And the title of the work is Spectrum, and so I was just thinking about responding to not just that site. For me, it's kind of just a metaphor for life, but that's up and down, I don't know. But just thinking about how, I guess I was thinking about the human footprint, I think, and I just couldn't escape that. And the environment isn't necessarily big in my practice at all, but it was just in relation to that site and travelling to that space and just seeing literally the land being cut away right outside of this amazing kind of utopian, I don't know, artist space or something. It was just something I couldn't move away from. And also, I use relationships as a metaphor as well, so it was about the landscape, but it was also about this idealising of people and experiences and relationships and how it goes from one to the other. But in my mind, it doesn't stop at despair, it goes back to idealism, and that it's a constant kind of fluctuation between the two. It's not that the despair is the end point, but yeah, that's kind of how I was thinking about it.
Great. Talking about action and collective action, Gordon, you've been involved with a couple of quite significant collectives through your career. I'm thinking mainly of Bamali in Sydney, and then more recently Proper Now here in Brisbane. Do you want to maybe talk about those experiences and how they either did create some kind of change in terms of your professional career or the careers of artists who are involved, or maybe more broadly what that experience meant for you as an artist?
Yeah, for me, when I was more or less just starting out, I was studying in Sydney about 1989, and that's when I became involved with Bamali. Bamali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative was a urban-based, I guess, cooperative of artists who are like-minded, because prior to them being formed, all the galleries and institution used to only just show art, from the desert or barks, and all these young artists got about to alter that and change it. So they formed a group of people and called themselves Bamali. And Bumali means to hit or to make a mark, and it's a Wiradjuri word. So they got together, and I guess as a collective, they worked, and in a sense, looking back now, they had changed the landscape quite a lot, within Sydney. And yeah, I was a part of them, for 4 or 5 years while I lived in Sydney. And it was just a wonderful experience to, be in that environment that they created as well. And with Proper Now, a local collective, and basically all the members of Proper Now, we were just friends, basically, and somehow we gave ourselves a name, or at least Vern and Richard gave ourselves a name, and Proper Now means proper, doing things right, doing things in line with protocol, and now means, now responding to the time in which we're in. And I guess one of the criteria that brought us together was, of course, the political climate, and responding to those scenarios and situations as they arise. And it was great, to be in a group like that, because they were quite overt in many ways with their thinking and what they expressed through their art. And also, I guess, we gave ourselves permission to do whatever we want. I mean, whenever we've done our art, we have to run the gauntlet with each other. And, some of the things and some of the comments about what we have done can be quite brutal as well. So within our collective, anything outside that was quite child play. And I think the worst kind of thing that one can do is be censored, I guess not by, church or multimedia or by the public, but I think the worst kind of censorship that we told ourselves was when you censor yourselves. So we were able to kind of perhaps move a little bit, I suppose, in the thinking of ourselves as well. If we affected or altered, people's perception of art in any way, I think it's a positive thing. But I mean, basically we're still happening, so, we're still a work in progress, even though, we're getting on a little bit, but yeah.
Shah, and we're looking at some of Shah's work on the slideshow now. I'd like you to talk about the work Silent Conversation, which isn't that one, but it's the work with. I have the remote. Oh, I did it. I told you I did it. Thank you. So don't give me the power. But maybe you can just start talking about that work. I think maybe your intention and then the process of that project.
Yeah, Silent Conversation was a postcard project where I printed a postcard which had an image of a boat which I made out of newspaper and cardboard, and on the surface of the boat I whitewashed the surface of the boat with white paint, and then wrote my own story, the journey that I took coming to Australia. And then I made a postcard out of that, and about 2,000 or 3,000 postcard. And one day I hopped on a train here from South Bank and got off at Yeronga and did a walk distributing these postcards.
At the dropping?
Yeah, dropping at the mailboxes. And at the back of the postcard, I posed this question to respond to people, what do they think of asylum seeker? And the reason for that question was that I was getting conflicting responses when I was meeting people. They were welcoming me, or my friends, but looking at the news or some portion of politics were against the asylum seeker, and they wanted to send them back in year 2000, even now, you know. So I just wanted to hear from people in their own space and time to think, to sit and think and deeply, without pressure of me standing in front of them, you know, or anyone else, like so they could respond from their, you know, heart. I received about 12, 13 postcards out of 2,000, 3,000 postcards, and most of them were positive response.
So 12 or 13 out of 3,000 postcards were sent back.
Yeah. So which I didn't expect, and it was one of my project here at university, one of my assignments. So it was Sebastian Diamora was my supervisor, and he thought if I get one, I'd be lucky. But I got about 12, and he was surprised. And he kind of gave me the idea to provide, instead of my own address, to provide a post box. And I said, why? They said, it's dangerous. Don't put your own address. So for me, it was kind of surreal. Why would someone come and harm me? He said, no, just make sure you provide a post box. So yeah, and then the way that I displayed it, just got this idea of whirlpool, that the white postcards kind of a metaphor for refugees in detention center, and these responses and actually I wanted to send these responses to the detention center, and at the time I was working as an interpreter, doing trips to Manus Island, to Curtin, and I approached immigration. They said no, we will not allow it. So I came up with this idea of how to install it, and that the conversation that was about to happen between the people that responded and to the refugees that were in detention, it didn't happen. So it's still in silent. Yeah.
So this work is really about your interest in exploring that disconnect between your own experience coming to Australia and interacting with the community and the public or perception that media and maybe political figures were sort of projecting. Has that work inspired you, or have you made other works subsequently that continue that sort of interaction? No, I haven't made like a work that would like conversational work or participation that would involve participation. But I have, wherever I have exhibited this work, I've left some empty postcards, blank postcards for people to write their view. And I had an exhibition at Logan Arts Gallery, which was funded by RADF, Regional Arts Fund. But there I got some nasty response, which for me it was good that I was at least getting people that had no kind of, maybe had no voice. They were voicing their opinion, so that they still they could feel more lighter. So I was happy that I had provided for those people this opportunity that they could pour their anger. Yeah. So, but other than that, no, I haven't. Yeah. Courtney, a lot of your work is about or informed by your own personal experience, and how difficult is that in terms of revealing yourself, or is it really something that's really important in terms of connecting with an audience?
I think it's difficult. I think I find it, I cloak it in form, I think is what I do. I think I put all of the stuff into the work, but then I give it camouflage with, you know, a formal, minimal, gestural kind of appearance, which I think is my way of protecting myself, which I'm trying to break down a little bit more. But I think that I feel like we can only make work from our own experience. We can't use other people's voices. That's my opinion, is that we can only speak from our own experience, and we can only make work about that, because that's the only thing we're knowledgeable about or experts in. So for me, it's important that that be the basis, but I'm still learning how to be. I feel vulnerable in the work, but am I being truly vulnerable in the work? I'm not sure.
Can you, I've just pulled up this image from your Metro Arts exhibition. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is this formal quality to your work, in that you're interested in the object. And I was just, these works are quite curious in their materiality, I guess, and form, and maybe you could just talk about the relationship or how they operate in the gallery space.
So this exhibition was called Looking Out, and the mountains are called the mountains between us. But it's a kind of, everything comes together in my work. I think another way of reducing it down is to just have little moments that then interact with each other to tell a whole narrative. But one of the things that I am working through is this idea of value in art as well, and like what is, you know, Gordon was talking about who gets shown and who doesn't, and what gets kind of validated and what doesn't, and that's something that I'm really interested in investigating. And I was lucky enough to get some funding for the show, so I made some neons because I'm drawn to them, because I'm drawn to sexy things. And I've been working with text in my practice for a long time, and it was a really great opportunity to explore that material. But then I felt so uncomfortable with that I had to make objects to kind of counterbalance that. So they're just paper mache objects from tissue, coloured tissue paper. And the plinths that I used are from Curbside Collection, because it was my way of kind of looking at, telling the narrative in a way that's related to life or something. So I guess, I'm seduced by materials, but I'm also conscious of the weight that they also bring with them.
Gordon, I want to talk to you about, I would like you to talk about your Murrayland cycle of paintings, and I am going to use the clicker so we can actually talk about them in front of them. So these are arguably your most significant series of paintings to date, and they're very complex things. Could you perhaps talk about their inception and development?
Well, they're my most recent works, actually. It's the most recent finished work. And basically what it is, it's called Murrayland, and it's a history of Queensland from an Aboriginal perspective. It's called Murrayland because it's about Queensland. Queensland is actually England, so it's not this place, the state that we're living in. It's Murrayland, because all the blackfellas in this state, we call ourselves Murrays, and we still believe that this is our land. And what Murrayland is a history of this land that we're on from an Aboriginal perspective. It came about, there's an Australian curator that's based in Amsterdam, and Vivian Zahel's her name, and she was taken by this work by Shabumba Mutulu, who's a Congolese artist working in the mid-70s, and Shabumba painted the history of the Congo from his perspective, Congo, that area was colonised by Belgium, and King Leopold was probably one of the most brutal leaders in the world. They say that his atrocities surpassed Hitler's atrocities on the people of the Congo. So he'd done 101 paintings of his history, and they were quite brutal paintings, but they were often little paintings painted on, you know, sacks, and he painted scenarios and put a bit of text about what had happened. And Vivian saw his work and then must have seen something in my work, so she asked me to paint a history of Queensland from my perspective. And yeah, Murray Land is the first one, and you know, like the history of a place is just so, it is quite a lot. So I took the timeline between the beginning of creation time right up until now, going into the future, and just took points on that timeline that affected us and just done a picture of it, basically. It was selected for Documenta. Actually, I got invited to put it in probably about, you know, 2 or 3 years before Documenta, and I was blown away by it. I said, oh, I'll deliver 3 paintings.
How big is that, just to give people a sense?
Yeah, that painting is 10 metres long by 2 metres high, and it's just made up of about 15 to 20 scenarios. But anyway, I promised them 3 paintings like this, and they're 6 months out. I said, oh, I can deliver 2. 2 months out, I said, I'll be flat out finishing 1. So that was the painting that I done. But when I got there, they allocated this big space, so I had to improvise a bit. So I went in the space and I walked around, and there were artworks at the back that went from ceiling to floor. So I said, oh, I can't just extend the line from Murrayland 1 and then just work like that. So I ended up painting on the wall, and the text says something up there, Murrayality victorious, Aboriginal eyes ancient triumphant. So the concept was, that was the first painting. If I was to the last painting, what would it look like? So I guess I imagined victory, and that was my imagination of victory. And all it is that the Aboriginalisation of Australia is my victory, and that just means everyone in Australia see things Aboriginal way. But yeah, that would be my conclusion. I'm working on the second painting at the moment, which is, well, actually it's rolled up in a big crate in my studio. So
how big's that one?
It's 10 metres long by 3 metres high, so it's a little bit wider. And that work there was a work that I done in Athens. If we can go back.
We might come back to
okay,
that one.
No worries.
I want to ask Shah about your use of the boat. The boat is a repeated form in your work, and obviously has quite. Is that a plane?
No, that's a boat.
It's a boat.
Yeah.
The boat obviously has. It's the first time I've been familiar with Shah's work. The boat obviously is a loaded symbol, particularly in the Australian context, and thinking about things like the Tampa, and interestingly, the boat has been, refugee boats have been an important source for a number of artists, including Judy Watson, who was on a panel here last week, and in terms of broader ideas around refugees and migration, Vernon Arkey's work, The Island, that was commissioned by this gallery and shown a number of months ago. So boats are vessels which carry people from one place to another, but the boat has sort of been weaponised in the Australian context.
Yeah.
I think there are more asylum seekers who come to Australia by plane, but we don't seem to have an issue. We don't seem to get as tortured about people coming in planes. So I just wondered, with your experience and background, could you talk about the importance of the boat in your work?
Well, yeah, first of all, as you said, that the boat has been weaponized. I think it's, if I'm not wrong, it sits at the conscience of Australian society, because this land has been taken from their true owners by boat. They came by boat and took over this land. So maybe because of that, the new people that come by boat, they think that they're going to take over them. But yeah, for me, I think it's it's become kind of my identity, part of my identity, because we were called the boat people, and later on they changed it into queue jumpers and then whatnot. So, but I kind of owe my life to the boat, because it's a kind of first time in my life that I came across a boat was from Indonesia. I hopped on a boat and it took me like 5 days till the Australian Navy intercepted us, and then another 2 days on a bigger boat that we arrived in Broome. We landed in Broome, and then my life kind of was saved. But then another chapter of trouble started. I was detained for about 7 months in Curtin IRPC in Western Australia, and then was released on a temporary protection visa here in Brisbane, and and spent about 6 years until I think 5 or 6 years until I became a citizen. So boat for me is a symbol of kind of freedom. In a way, I got my freedom by hopping on a boat and crossing the sea and getting here.
How long were you got in Indonesia?
My true age is not confirmed, but when I arrived, I registered myself as 18 years old. Yeah, because back in Afghanistan, they don't put date of birth. We don't celebrate date of birth, and they write it on a back of important books like Quran or other books that have gone through generation. And when I tried to find that book from when I got out and wanted to find it out about my true age, the book was, I think, given away and it was disappeared. So when I arrived, I registered myself as about 17 years old, 34, 35. Yeah.
He looks good, right? Younger than me, anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. That's the good part, that I don't have to worry that how old I am. So it keeps me young.
Courtney, text is really important. Well, it's actually important in all of these artists' practices, and we might sort of think about this with all the panel. And you talked about your love of neon as well. What is it about language, text? Is it the directness? Or maybe you could just talk about how text works.
For me, the text is an interesting way to engage. So for me, I feel like art for me is about connecting. But the text always starts as like something that I'm telling myself. So it's really, these works are just talking to me. But then I hope that then I'm talking to someone else. And then, but I like text because I think you can be direct, but also open and ambiguous at the same time. And I think that that's what is interesting about language, is that it has so many different meanings, depending on settings or moods or backgrounds or, what happened this morning, etc. But for me, the text is, they're a reminder to myself, and that's how they start, and then I hope it's a way to engage.
Gordon, you also work with text quite prominently in your work, and there's often alliteration or words, funny word plays, but you've also talked about how English isn't your first language.
Yeah, there's an old cliche that I use a lot. I say, English is my second language. I don't know my first, because colonisation had taken it away from me. Therefore, I have a licence to use the English language whichever way I want, by misspelling it, breaking up the words, making up my own words, and basically bastardising, you know, the Queen's English, so to speak. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I use language in my work, but also one of my first shows when I was a student at Art House in Newtown in Sydney. At opening night, I hit it really hard and I had to watch the gallery the next morning. And one of the first visitors into the gallery was my print teacher, Rose Vickers. And she comes in there and comes over, you know, blurry-eyed, and she grabs a list of works, and she grabbed the list of works and goes up to the works, looking over her glasses and, you know, going like that, and then going to the next work. And then she spun around, done a pirouette, and came over to me and said, Gordon, I love your titles. It's like the first line of a poem going into the poetry, which is your work of art. I thought I was in trouble, but I wasn't for something. And you know, even though I was all hungover and stuff like that, I took that on board, what she said, and then I started writing the actual title on the artworks that I have done. And then since then, it's developed into using more, you know, text and words, and I use words and text like a major part of the composition of the work, but and you know, that becomes part of the picture basically.
Shah, what about you? I noticed newspaper is a significant material for you. That's obviously full of text. Have you used text in other contexts with regards to your work?
Like recent works that I have come out of my honours degree is about, I use text, but I use text because I miss the writing in my first language, that I could not, you know, get the chance to study it, fully understand it, and although I can read and Farsi or Dari, but I like the aesthetic of my language, and particularly a font called Nostalgic. So that's like the font was created using like natural curves. So I see forms in them, like there's like the one with two eyes. It looks like a person, a body. The meme that is hung upside down. So I see figures in them as if they're animates.
So using the formal quality of the script as well.
Yeah, to kind of lure. So this on this this is a textile piece, silk, newspaper printed on silk, and on top of it the script says crimes. But my original intention was to write refugee, but it is still can spell refugees. But when I first was installing it, I thought maybe I can make another words out of it, and surprisingly it spelled crimes. So kind of the work completed itself. So yeah. And the recent works that I am making, they're like sound bites, and using the aesthetic of the nostalgic Persian script. Yeah.
And what the newspaper the newspaper imagery that you use, is that significant? Is that about things like refugees, or is it?
Yeah, this piece has got a lot of history and story. Like these news clips were collected by former immigration officer who turned to a refugee activist, my friend Adele knows, Frederica Sting. And when we arrived in Brisbane, I met her in one of the welcoming center for refugees, and I remember when I got this grant from RADF, I remember that she was collecting, she has taken a lot of our photos. She had a camera, and I remember she was collecting news clippings. So I approached her and I said, do you still have them? And she said, yeah, and I think she wanted to donate it to a UQ museum. So before she gave it to them, I got the chance to take it and scan it through and print it on silk. And the title of this work is Now. So the idea behind is that these words that were uttered like in the past, and and the material that is printed on has kind of woven us, the Australian society, of what we are now. So, and what we have ended up to be, and in the future, also it will be still now, because what we say now, what we have done in the past, and in this case particularly about migrants and refugees, will be in the future. What will be in the future is because of these words that were uttered by politics, by I don't know, different opinions.
The power of words.
Yeah. So it is woven us
together.
Now, yeah.
Courtney, I want to go back. Well, actually, we could talk about this one, but I wanted to talk about your other participatory project. Was it Conversing About the Other? Is that?
That's that.
And that was an ongoing series of conversations?
Yeah, I think that it's still ongoing. Shah was actually a facilitator last year. Yeah, last year down in Melbourne for the series. So I think it stemmed out of wanting to understand this, like the term "the other" kept coming up all of the time in institutions, museums, galleries, etc., without any definition of what this thing was, and it just kind of everyone was lumped into this other, and the other being not white, male, hetero, etc. And that sat really uncomfortably for me, and I just wanted to understand what it was more, I suppose, or to talk about these things, because I think that we don't, if we feel uncomfortable, we don't talk about things, and then things get left unsaid, and then nothing changes, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was having these conversations with my peers and my friends about, the frustration with kind of normativity and how that's presented. And so I invited the people that I was having these conversations with to come into, I was artist in residence at Metro at 2016, and they were amazing and gave me the space to kind of host these conversations where it was very casual. I would ask someone to extend the conversations that we were having and how they responded to either the term the other or otherness, to kind of expand our thinking around those words. So it was a very simple gesture, I think, that had a tremendous impact on my life and continues to do so. So I hosted 4 in Brisbane, and then I had a short residency in LA where one of the artists was also working with these ideas, so they facilitated the conversation, and then I went down to Melbourne and ran 4 conversations at Testing Grounds, which is when I met Shah, actually by accident, and it just seemed like yet another organic kind of extension of that, and I hope to run some more eventually, but I think, I realised it really only means something if it's part of an ongoing conversation, so it was, that's kind of where it's at.
Shah, what was your experience of Courtney's project?
It was, we were just talking about it before. I don't remember that if I've kind of forced myself, like asking that I want to be part of it, but yeah, it was a good experience. I took a text that I wrote in my first year of study here, and it was a performance. I did a performance with the big board that I made, I said, and it was a reflection of my time in detention center, kind of sending a letter that I did not get the opportunity to send to the Australian public, talking about how the trees around me in the detention center doesn't have fruit. So it was, and the trees back at home that were around my house, they are all had like fruit trees. So in a way, I was thinking that maybe this journey is fruitless. It's I shouldn't have had this journey that I've ended up, and I think I made people cry there in the so that they were really affected by the text. Although it was really, I still have it. It's really as similar to Gordon. English is not my first language, so it was really very raw writing, not edited. So yeah.
Gordon, you touched on it. We touched on it before. Scale and your work. You don't really make small paintings.
Yeah, I think that's true. Only because I have got some small works, but I think the reason why is because
like this work here.
Yeah.
From memory, it was, and I remember this exhibition at Milani Gallery. I think that painting was 3 meters tall by 5 meters wide. And the subject, you were responding or referring to the death in custody on Palm Island.
Yeah.
It's a fairly heavy subject matter at an immense scale.
Yeah, and the subsequent reaction with the government and police after the Murrays on Palm Island burnt down the jail. Yeah, I guess I do large paintings because the concepts and ideas, appear large and big, and if I do it small, it doesn't do what I'm thinking any justice. So my peers said that I suffer from little man syndrome, like Napoleon. So, I mean, that could be too, I won't discount that as well. But anyway, I have, in the Murray Land scenarios that I had done, there's a little section there about Kiawea, about the Dutch ship called Dufkin, and Captain Willem Jantz, who mapped 360 kilometres of coastline on the west side of Cape York Peninsula. And there's a place called Kiawea. In the Dutch language, Kiawea means turn around. And the reason why they turned around was because 2 of their shipmates were speared by the descendants of where Arakoon is now. Now, I'd done a little small section on the painting there. And when I was doing the painting, and
on the top left?
Go to the larger version. Yeah, you can see the little orange shirt where the red arrow turns around. That's one of the Dutch shipmates getting a spear in the chest. But it's a little one. And then, after I'd done the painting and I reassessed the importance of that time, that was the first time that we've driven off a foreign invader who was to invade our land. So that was quite a major historical thing for us to do as a people, to drive off a superpower. And they done it up there. So that little painting is now a larger painting that's going to happen in my studio. So it's like a little idea when it first came, but it's really a big idea or a big concept or an important thing that it does deserve space on a canvas.
And this use of vignettes, you talk about ideas, there's a lot of information on that, well, in all of your work, really. But can you maybe talk about the logic of that kind of composition?
Yeah, well, in doing Murray Land, like, I looked at Shubumba Mutulu's 101 paintings on the history, and he painted a lot of these little paintings, on flour sack size sort of thing, and And when I initially started, I tried to do that. I divided the canvas up in little squares and wanted to put each little historical concept in that, but it didn't work because the concepts and ideas went beyond the little rectangles or squares. So I just threw the concepts and ideas down on the canvas as they unfolded, and as it so happens, certain ideas and concepts connect in some kind of way. For example, there's a peninsula, a Cape York Peninsula, where I've got, the Dufkin scenario on the other side, and then Captain Cook on the other side. So those two vignettes connect in that way. And, there's a whole lot of other little scenarios that connected, where a ship accidentally bumped into Australia, and it was the Portuguese, They discovered Australia before the Dutch and also before the English. But even before then, there was the Chinese in the 1400s. But all we know is of the English because of the history. But I connect the scenarios in a way according to, the thought patterns at the time and the similarities within the concepts. For example, you can see all these Grim Reapers putting the stick with a bit of rag on it into an island which was now called Possession Island. Possession Island is off the coast of North Queensland, but they claimed all of the east coast by putting a flag in an island. But the images that I use there is the image from when the Americans claimed the Iwo Jima, the island of Iwo Jima, with the famous photo of the flag. So, like, just juxtaposing historical and what's in the psyche of the population to, I guess, kind of trick them into looking at something, or people prey on what's familiar, I guess. So people see that and there might be a double take because they think that there's something familiar and they don't know what it is. So it's like juxtaposing these things as well as concept on the canvas, but juxtaposing it what is common thought, within the population or common thinking.
We'll come back to it. I said I wasn't going to use the clicker, and now I'm obsessed with it. Don't give me technology, please. Shah, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your choice of materials. Obviously, you studied sculpture; that was your major at QUT and QCA rather. I mean, some of the materials seem quite deliberate and potent in their sort of symbolism. Could you maybe talk a bit about your materials?
Well, before I used to use materials that were like really up on your face, like the one with the barbed wire, the hammock, which was a reflection on my travel to Manus Island when I went there as an interpreter and came back.
So when was that? Could you talk about that?
I think it was 2013-14, and the detention center. I used to work in the detention center, and it's situated on the bank of this water, like the sea. So you could see literally the sea is like 5-4 step away from the barbed wire, the fence. But people are like locked up there. And when you used to talk about, and in the media, there was this talk that they are living on an island. It's like a resort. So this idea came to me of a hammock and using barbed wire as kind of contradicting it. And I call it forced leisure. So that they will put their,
There is sort of a dark humour to that as well, I think.
Yeah. So it's kind of having fun on that concept of that. These people live on Manus Island, Christmas Island. An island is normally associated with having a good time. People, going on holidays, a place where having spending your holidays. So yeah, that was the last my last year project in university.
Can you talk about these works? Are they paper or fabric? What?
No, these are canvas. So these are the new works that I have come out of my honors course, and the reason that I went totally kind of so minimalism towards minimalism is because I was sick of kind of dealing with this issue. Like I was
You've exhausted
thinking,
yourself.
yeah, I was thinking that this issue has kind of put me in this cycle of that I cannot get out of.
Do you feel pigeonholed as an artist? Oh, that's the refugee artist.
That as well. Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to get away and to kind of project myself that there's other sides as well. So and accidentally I kind of picked up charcoal from our like traditional barbecue that we make as Afghanistani people, kebabs, and I used it on canvas. First I just mixed it with glue and applied it really roughly, and then slowly I built it towards this work. And then first of all, the first time I took it to my supervisor was just blank canvas with blackness. I said, this is what I'm thinking now, I'm stuck, like I'm nowhere. So it was like I was having kind of a block mind. And then he said, yeah, this is good. No, nothing is something. Nowhere is somewhere.
So you cut back into the canvas. Is that? Can you describe what is happening in that image there?
Yeah. So then I decided to kind of break that to give something more to the surface, like because I'm not a minimalist artist, and I couldn't get my hand around it. How will I explain it to people when, I display it and they say, what is this? And I say, I don't know. So the first idea that came to mind is to use something from my own cultural background to give life to the canvas. So that is like a sound bite. So, and it's the first letter of our alphabet, and it makes the sound R. So, and it's coming out kind of a metaphor. Is it like a flight leaving a place and kind of at the same time attached to the place. So, which gave me this idea of kind of exploring the structure of the canvas. So, and then I put behind the canvas, I covered the back of the canvas, so to give an extra space to explore the back of the canvas. So another space is given. So
inside the canvas.
Yeah,
the canvas.
Yeah. So the sound doesn't go anywhere.
It's contained.
It's contained within it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So these are like sound bites, and they sit, and as you can see, they sit in margins. They don't sit in the middle, or they're not, into the limelight. They sit in the margins. So again, it's a metaphor.
So they're quite sculptural as well. So there's that connection to your.
So I wanted to give it a kind of third dimension. 3D.
And that connection you were talking about, the charcoal, and that connection to your Afghani heritage, is that something that's important to your work?
Well, charcoal, because I make my own charcoal, after that I started to make my own charcoal. Like, you lit a fire, and I like sitting beside the fire, and we make kebab, and looking at that process of fire, as if like the timber that I put, it goes through kind of a sacrificial process, which resonates with me, kind of what has gone through what I've gone through and what the people, my country has gone through, war and destruction. So it resonates deeply in that regard. But then I wanted to give it some beauty to allure people. So when you come across it, the first kind of time you see it, it doesn't say much, and then when you, it slowly reveals what the intention is, you know, what I want to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Courtney, can we talk about Level, which was, for those of you who don't know, a collective, a feminist collective that was that operated in Brisbane some years ago now?
From 2010 to 2018. Yeah, so recently. But so it was it started as a gallery space. We had a gallery in Newstead for a year and a half that I started with Rachel Haynes and Alice Lang, two other artists, and it came out of a frustration that, so feminism is big now, but then it wasn't really, and not in Brisbane either. No one was really talking about gender stuff. It felt like to us as like young emerging artists. And so our way of dealing was that we thought we would make a show, and then suddenly that turned into 3 galleries, 10 studios, and a residency space by accident. Almost.
And there was a real dearth of spaces, like physical spaces, at that time in Brisbane.
Yeah. Oh, you mean So and there was probably one or two other RAs at the time, and then the feminist one, but it was a really generative space that then. So we got to work with a lot of amazing Brisbane artists, whether they were showing with us or had studios with us, and we got to have these incredible conversations about gender and equity, and then that expanded to many other things as we realised that certainly wasn't the only thing that we needed to be talking about. And then we were joined by Anita Holtzclaw and Courtney Pedersen and Caitlin Fransman, and it became before that we kind of got rid of the gallery because we didn't want to be administrators anymore, and we wanted to kind of do more project-based things, and it became more of a collective, I suppose, and more we would host forums and make art together and host other conversations and things. Yeah.
So that sense of community was very important.
Yeah, it was really, really integral to, I think, my sense of place in the Brisbane art community, especially.
So having that physical space as well as that emotional space, that connection.
Emotional and intellectual, and just knowing that there was a community that kind of got it in a sense. You know, we didn't always agree, and you know that was part of the joy of it as well, was figuring out our politics through understanding that it wasn't the same as the other person that we were working with and such, but that could expand our practices and who we were as people as well.
And did your experience with Level inform those participatory projects like the other project?
I think so. It gave, because I always saw Level as separate to my practice. I think like I made art with a capital A, and then I ran a gallery, or was in part of a collective, and that was where I got to do my political stuff, my socially engaged, stuff. And then I sort of went, oh, hang on a minute, like I can do that. It's all important, and it helped me to kind of find the confidence, I think, to have conversations in that way. Yeah.
Gordon, I want to go back to the Solidarity mural that you were commissioned to make for Documenta, and that was painted on the wall of the Athens School of Art. I think that it's a really good example of this idea of a radical pedagogy that we've sort of posited tonight. Can you talk about that experience of going to Athens and then the process of making that work within that context?
Yeah, one of the things about Athens and Documenta coming into Greece as well, well, the history of Greece is it's very contested right from the government forming there in the early years, I guess, and with Documenta being a German institution as well, and going to Athens, it wasn't welcome really. That's a feeling as an artist that I've got there. It was just another case of another foreign invader coming there to try and tell the Greeks what to do. So that was the attitude towards Documenta being there. But as an artist, the artists were made welcome by the Greek people and the people of Athens, and were treated with respect. But the institution of Documenta kind of wasn't. Does that make sense? You can vaguely see up on the wall at the top there is some anti-Documenta graffiti there, and at the time of coming there and seeing the scaffold, one of the scaffold had like a cartoon face with someone sticking the finger down there, and Documenta and all that. But it's quite funny, there was a vacant wall there that was left for me to do some work on, but the surface there wasn't defaced at all. So there was this welcoming, but outside, there was this protest about another foreign intervention as well. But going there too, it's like whenever I go to another place, you can go there with concepts and ideas that you want to do. I had to do that anyway, in order, to do a proposal so they can look for a wall. So I done all these drawings and things that I would like to do after doing much research. But once you get there, that's not worth much other than, the paper that it's painted on or drawn on as well. So, I went there and engaged for about a week with, some of the young artists that were there, and we walked around Athens, and we walked, to another area where all the murals and graffiti were, sort of thing. So, I feel that, I had to observe certain protocols and get certain approvals for certain things, and and slowly, the concepts and ideas that ran by sort of unfolded and then transpired on the wall as well. And basically, it's the old cliched work of that symbol of power and strength. And written down the bottom in red, white, and with solidarity. And of course, that clenched fist is like coming out of a tree, and the roots of the tree are bleeding or cutting into this big word solidarity, and and it's kind of bleeding out of the roots. These little gold and silver hearts, and what the statement was saying. Also, that I think there was a statement from Che Guevara that said something like, with the, I'm trying to think of the cliche, but it goes something like, with the fear of sounding ridiculous, the true revolutionary is guided by strong feelings of love. So that's the little text that was written there, and like, I had to negotiate what I had to do there with the locals in order for that. And the wonderful thing is that, it's one of the major thoroughfares, and the greater Documenta show was a little bit further down in this big major building. So there was a lot of people that had to take place, and right in front, a little bit further back this way, there was a performance by this wonderful African performance groups who had like milk crates, and inside the milk crates there were all these bottles. And there was, probably about 15 women, all in white, and they carried these milk crates out there, and they actually stood on the bottles for, 4 to 5, 6 hours, and one by one they each stopped. But, for me, to sit in front and watching this symbol, I'd like to think that I aided in some way of them fulfilling their performance as well. So that was a wonderful thing to think about it, and you know, it's basically straightforward as well, and it just reeks of my empathy, you know, for what is happening in Athens and in Greece.
Thanks, Gordon. And that idea of showing respect to that culture that you were visiting as a guest. And that engagement, that dialogue and discussion, I think is really interesting that you had in that building that sense of trust as well. I mean,
well, absolutely. It's no different here, because you know, a lot of the blackfellas that are here in Brisbane are not from here. Yeah, so I'm Wanyi. I'm from up North Queensland near Cloncurry, Mount Isa. But being here, traditionally, this is not my country. This is not my home. So. You know, to a certain extent, there's protocols that we as Aboriginal people, we live with and we grow with. You know, like the wider community may not see this, but while I'm here, like there are certain protocols that we observe all the time in our life as well. So you know, going to Athens and to another country and engaging with you know, the people in Athens, and wherever we go anywhere, you know, the First Nations people everywhere, we extend, you know, those same kind of courtesies and as a matter of protocol. Yeah.
That sense of community and connection is something that's come up again and again tonight. Shah, I just wanted to know, do you have a community of artists or people that you feel connected to? You said that you moved to Melbourne about 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I used to live with a self-taught artist back here in Brisbane, and that is how I got into art as well. He kind of inspired me. Yeah, but he left in 2007 or 8, he left for Melbourne, and I haven't, where I live now, there is a big presence, like community in Melbourne, in the suburb of Dandenong, but I live like an hour away from Dandenong. But yeah, online there are few artists, funny artists. One famous artist in Adelaide, Elias Alawi, which will have a show in July in Adelaide, group show. Apart from that, yeah, no, there's no like a community, like there's no gathering as such that artists and writers or musicians would come and sit. And I've been thinking about that too in the future, once I be able to do such things, that I would like to create a space with the help of other fellow artists to come together and, you know, celebrate and be together and you know, bounce ideas of each other and yeah, have that sense of home away from home. Yeah.
That sounds like a great idea. You should get some advice from these two. I think they could give you some good tips. How are we going for time? Questions? Yeah. First of all, do any of the panel members have a question for each other? I just thought, are there any ideas that have come up that you wanted to explore further? No? You talked out. Are there any questions from the audience? So we've either answered everything or we're really boring. Can't wait to leave. No?
Yeah? So it was interesting to me, like the question as a whole, or the topic as a whole, is about change as part of the artist's provenance, I guess. And we were all sort of kind of quick to say, well, that's not something I think about, or I'm not sure that, like, I just put it out there and whatever happens, or I don't want to sort of, you know, attach that weight to the work. But then you did all talk about change in different ways throughout the evening, in terms of, like, not necessarily within the work that you were doing, but within the ways that you were operating as an artist, like especially as members of collectives, or as showing in particular places like in Documenta or in Athens House around Documenta. So I'm wondering if you found that over the course of your career, does change come not from the art, but from the way that you operate as an artist in certain contexts?
Yes, I think so. I mean, just recently I had a show in the suburbs that I live, and I came. A journalist came for an interview, and the first question she asked that, don't you think that people will be angry? And the suburbs that I live, I think it's very, if I could say, white dominant. Although most of the people are very welcoming. And I said, it was surprised to me that why she would ask such a question. But then when I spoke to the curator, she said, yeah, we have had some people, having a frown on this idea of like showing works of refugees or artists from a refugee background and bringing this issue, here. So my answer to that was that I think people have the right to be angry. I cannot stop people from being angry, but if I can be a facilitator through an event like an exhibition or myself being there to engage a discussion, to talk, for people to come and talk, so that they may, understand better why I'm here or why the refugees that come here, because all they hear or see is from the media or the politicians, and you're right. It's not, the work is kind of a vessel, but it's us, it's me. Like when I come across people and start in conversation, engage in conversation, that I kind of see that they go, oh, okay, that's how it is, So they come to a realization that what they heard or what they have, been told is not totally true. There is some truth to it, but not all of it. So, yeah, you're right. It's the way that I guess the art scene operates. Can bring change, but I don't think that I myself am aiming for that. It's I think the practice itself is like.
But it's beyond. I think the point is that it's beyond just the art making. It's everything you're doing in terms of being an advocate and speaking on behalf of other people from your community or other refugees, and being there and being visible. That you make that difference.
Exactly, it's having that being active, like trying to turn up to,
Turn up.
Just to have a stand, and then whatever happens.
Yeah. I guess as an artist, like I personally don't consciously, make art in order to alter or change. But you're right, these devices or systems are there that can perhaps do those very things, and also in another level, also, I think a lot of what we do, even though it's out of the studio and out of our mind and out of our thoughts, the work perhaps does have a life of its own in a way as well, and there is a lot of things that we can't control, and change is one of those things, and who perceive the work and how they perceive the work. Like for example, there was a work that I'd done quite some years back called Sacred Nation, Scared Nation, Indoctrination. And in that work, there was some, swear words that a certain expatriate who viewed the work in the National Gallery was quite offended by. And that person let it be known to the media, and in turn, some right-wing journalists, saw the work and wrote up an article, and what it did was just create interest in the work. The very next day that the Hun wrote this article, the very next day, lots of people from the public were coming in with rolled up newspapers or with the newspaper, going straight to the reception of the the National Gallery and wanting to know exactly where the work is. So in a sense, you know, like that kind of interest, that kind of agency for change, you know, is just within the whole system outside of how we operate, you know, and we just do what we do. And in a way, while the work is out there, it's kind of our accountability for that work is diminished in a way, because people respond how they will to whatever we put out there in the end, but we don't have any control, basically.
Courtney?
Yeah, I just agree with these guys. I think I mean, I just think about, I think it's difficult, right? Because I'm a very flawed human. So it's like creating change or whatever it is, it feels like a big thing. And I'm sitting here amongst, you know, amazing artists who are tackling big topics, and it's kind of, we're just doing what we can. Like, I feel like I'm just doing what I can with what I have.
That's probably a really nice way to end tonight's conversation on, unless there are any other questions. No? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel tonight, Courtney Coombs, Gordon Hooky and Sarwari. And thank you all for